Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's launch of incredibly important and timely research on the experiences of LGBTQ young people in terms of sexual harassment at work. My name is Tessa Boyd-Kane. I'm CEO of Australia's National Research Organisation for Women's Safety, ANROSE, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here and to welcome you today. Welcoming you, both people joining us in the room and also those streaming online, as we unpack the findings of Speaking Out at Work, sexual harassment of LGBTQ young people in the workplace and workplace training. Unfortunately, Auntie Kerry Kenton is not able to join us this morning, so I do want to begin by acknowledging country. For those of us here in the room, we're on the lands of the Darug people, the traditional owners, and I want to acknowledge also any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are present and who now reside within this area, and to recognise, in the context of the work to end gendered violence in this country, the leadership of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and the opportunity to walk alongside and behind our First Nations, particularly in understanding the context in which gendered violence occurs and the intersections for many people in terms of how that violence is experienced. I also want to particularly acknowledge the lives and experiences of LGBTQ young people affected by domestic, family and sexual violence, including sexual harassment. Those lives and that experience are represented in the research and are represented in the room today. And that's a really important part of the work we're doing today, to unpack the findings and to centre those experiences in the building of evidence, in the building of knowledge about that experience. So critical then to ensuring that our responses and our solutions work for the people that they are intended to support. We recognise at ANROSE that individual stories of courage, of hope and resilience are a really critical part of centering the voices of lived expertise in the evidence space. And we see that as part of our role in the production of knowledge and also in the way we communicate and share that knowledge in such as we're doing today. Given the context of the discussion today, I do want to recognise the impacts that these issues have in people's lives and to encourage people to look after themselves, both in the conversation we have today and in the work that it signals, that it invites us all to be a part of. This event is being recorded, so if at any point you need to step out or step away or disengage from the session, there will be opportunities to catch up later in the discussion. And importantly, the discussion is about pointing the way for the work ahead. So huge opportunity to be part of that work into the future. LGBTQ young people's experiences of sexual harassment at work are underpinned by homophobia, by biphobia, and by transphobia. The evidence points to the importance of prevention and intervention strategies that respond to the root causes and contexts of sexual harassment as key to their effectiveness. To do this, we need to centre the experiences of LGBTQ young people in how we understand that experience of sexual harassment and in what we do to end it. In the conversation today, we'll see that centering of expertise in action. The research we're releasing today highlights the critical need to improve employer as well as employee literacy on workplace sexual harassment. That literacy includes training on the experiences and needs of LGBTQ young people. It includes fostering culturally inclusive and safe workplaces, which are central to prevention efforts. And the research really encourages us to think about how we can foster that greater inclusivity in all workplaces. It also calls out particularly the roles for governments, for businesses, for workplace managers, for schools, universities and training institutions, all working alongside LGBTQ young people to tackle workplace sexual harassment targeted at LGBTQ young people. In terms of the context and the contribution of the research, we see that LGBTQ people are often overlooked, particularly in workplace sexual harassment research and policy discussions, where they focus on cisgender, heterosexual women, despite studies showing that harassment is equally experienced by LGBTQ individuals. We also see in the research that LGBTQ young people face increased marginalisation targeting their identity and age, among other factors like disability, indigeneity and ethnicity, and that all of those intersections exacerbate the harms then of sexual harassment experienced. And yet, despite this evidence, we know very little about that experience, and that's one of the things that makes this research so important. The report that we're releasing today addresses significant knowledge gaps and will be absolutely crucial for informing workplace policy and practice specific to LGBTQ young people. I also want to recognise that today is International Day of People with Disability, and recognising that in the context of this research, we found that 83% of participants with a disability and or a medical condition had reported a previous experience of workplace sexual harassment, compared to only 71% of participants without a disability or medical condition. Now, 71% is no small number, but recognising that disparity in experience reminds us again of the importance of those intersections in how sexual harassment is experienced. I think we'll probably hear more about that in the discussion today. So where I want to end is really just to recognise the broader context of building the evidence base that this report sits within. ANROS sets Australia's national research agenda, and the current agenda was co-designed with victim survivors, reflecting the commitment in that research agenda to centre voices of lived expertise in the building of the evidence base. We recognise that in the agenda, and we recognise there's a lot more work to do. Sexual harassment, also signalled in the research agenda, exists on a continuum with sexual violence, which is a key priority in the work for us ahead, recognising that while we have a national plan that brings together domestic, family and sexual violence, most of the research that has underpinned the directions in that national plan has focused on domestic and family violence. And the work to really understand sexual violence, including the intersections that shape people's experience of it, is still ahead for us. This study connects with that agenda by bringing both a systems and a social priority, looking at structural inequities, understanding individual expertise, and thinking about what are the systemic responses to those experiences and how we work together to end it. This report is the final in ANROS's sexual harassment research program, which ran from 2021 to now. It was commissioned in response to recommendations from the Respect at Work report led by the Human Rights Commission, and which recognised that we needed to really build a national evidence base on sexual harassment to guide policy and practice. We had 55 applications for this round with 4 external projects selected, so a real milestone in releasing this final report today. Collectively, the research funded in this round consistently demonstrates that there is frequently an absence of or limited utility in formal training and information about sexual harassment, that workplace sexual harassment is often normalised, particularly in sectors like hospitality and retail, industries which are both often feminised but also in which many young people work, and that it becomes almost an expected part of the job for many people going to work. Across these studies, participants were often unsure whether unsafe or unacceptable behaviours counted as workplace sexual harassment, and participants often spoke about and centred their feelings of discomfort rather than the unacceptable behaviour that they were having to experience. For LGBTQ young people in this research and in other studies funded under this research program, we heard from participants describing experience specifically that was intended to undermine or make them uncomfortable. And also that participants found culturally unsafe and non-inclusive workplaces as part of that level of unsafety that they were experiencing at work. So to hear more about the research, I'm really delighted now to introduce Distinguished Professor Kerry Robinson, to hand it over to Kerry and also to Dr. Erika Smith and Emma Jackson to talk about the report. Thank you, Kerry.
Thank you so much, Tessa, for that introduction to this very extensive report that's sitting on the table there. It has taken about 2.5 years to get it to where it is at this point. And I have a very short period of time to do what I think is really important up front, and that is to do the thank yous. And there are so many people to thank in terms of developing a report like this. So I would like to first off thank you to ANROS for the funds to actually do the research. And that has been a great deal of work has gone into it, as you can see, and that has been very much appreciated. I'd also like to thank colleagues in ANROS that have worked with us for the last 2.5 years. And I'd like to acknowledge Kimberley Jane, Nicola Help, Dorothy Blanc, and Elliot Holohan, and Bobby Hendry, who is the designer of this particular report. I'd also like to thank Tessa for that introduction and for the support that you've given this research as well. I'd like to thank our partners on this particular research project, and that was the LGBTIQ Health Alliance and 2010. Always key partners in doing this work, and they do fabulous work themselves, and we really look forward to taking this research forward with you into the dissemination and translation of this work into various components that we can actually get it down to. I'd like to also thank the research team. We had an excellent team. And those people are, Jane Ussher, Cristyn Davies, Jackie Ullman, Alex Hawkey, Marjadi, and Paul Byron, Kimberley Allison, Emma Jackson, and Erika Smith. A great, excellent team. You couldn't have put a better group of people together to do this work, and it was very much appreciated. I'd like to also thank the young people who are going to be on our panel today. Jay, I've heard speak before, and does fabulous work. And Catherine, really appreciate the time that you have given to this as well. And thank you to everyone who has turned up today to celebrate on one level, because it's important to get this out there and to actually move things forward with us. And thank you to the young people who have come. That's great. Great to see you here. And thank you so much to all those people who are registered online. We know you're there, and thank you. And I'd also like to acknowledge the fact that we have Anna Cody here, our Sex Discrimination Commissioner. And really thank you for the time taken to come here today. It's much appreciated. And for the work that you do in this area as well. Thank you. So we've got a great deal of things to get through. So I want to move on to a 10-minute glimpse, really, of what this extensive piece of work is about. And that is going to be presented to you by Erika Smith and Emma Jackson, who are two people who worked on this project together with the rest of us. So over to you two.
Okay, thank you so much for joining us this morning for the launch of the Speaking Out at Work report. Before we begin, on behalf of the Speaking Out at Work research team, I'd like to pay our respects to the Brahmaputra people of the Darug Nation and extend our respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us here today. The Speaking Out at Work team listed here comprised of academics from various disciplines and universities, and you'll hear from many of them today, so I won't go through everyone. The aims of the project with respect to LGBTQ young people, so the aims of this project were to understand the nature of sexual harassment in the workplace and workplace training sites, to investigate the perceptions that they had and responses to workplace sexual harassment, including reporting and the short and long-term impacts. Thirdly, to explore how multiple social inequalities intersect in their experiences of sexual harassment, ascertain their knowledge about their rights in the workplace, and finally, to co-develop resources for employers, employees, and LGBTQ young people, including information guidelines to address, manage, and prevent sexual harassment of LGBTQ young people. The Speaking Out at Work project employed a mixed methods methodology in a convergent parallel design comprising of a national online survey. Both closed and open-ended items were included in that survey, individual semi-structured qualitative interviews, and photo story interviews and images conducted as an additional qualitative mode of data collection. We received in total 1,001 survey responses with usable data, conducted 40 interviews, and collected 8 photo stories from young LGBTQ people across Australia. And to just sort of provide a bit of a snapshot, obviously the detail is in the report. The snapshot provided here is just, sorry, there's a lot of content. The mean average of participants was 21.7 years old. The largest group identifying themselves were cisgender women, 34%, followed by non-binary participants, 23%. Participants were able to self-describe their sexuality, and when specifying a single sexual and or romantic orientation, approximately 1/4 of participants described their orientation as each gay and lesbian, 27%, bisexual, 25%, and queer, 25%. 53% of the participants reported having a disability or medical condition that impacted their capacity to work. I'll now hand over to Emma Jacko.
Thank you, Erika. So our report tells the story of how LGBTQ young people come to experience these levels of workplace sexual harassment, from the foundations of how we understand workplace sexual harassment to the incidents themselves, responses, impacts, and finally the wider context that facilitates this harassment. In this brief overview of the findings, we're going to follow one of our interview participants, Luca, a 23-year-old queer non-binary person, to hear how queerness has shaped their experiences of workplace sexual harassment. The findings section of the report opens with an overview of the prevalence of workplace sexual harassment for LGBTQ young people. So chapter 3 in the report is where you want to go if you're looking for any of those high-level overview statistics. The headline number from this report is that 77% of LGBTQ young people have ever experienced workplace sexual harassment. And this rate was even higher for people with multiple intersecting identities. Luca's trans identity means that they are statistically more likely to have experienced workplace sexual harassment compared to their cisgender peers. When speaking about traditional stereotypes of workplace sexual harassment, Luca told us, quote, "I do think that the definition most people are working with is too small," unquote. Many participants made it clear that they had experienced workplace sexual harassment that was outside of traditional definitions, that stereotype harassment as male bosses making sexual overtures toward female employees. LGBTQ young people were not redefining workplace sexual harassment, rather extending and applying this traditional definition to be able to account for their LGBTQ specific experiences, and also calling for their experiences to be addressed in workplace training. Indeed, only 8% of people who had received training regarding workplace sexual harassment indicated that there was LGBTQ-related content in this training. LGBTQ young people reported a broad range of workplace sexual harassment incidents, including incidents that seemed to ignore their LGBTQ identity and other incidents where their LGBTQ identity made them a target. Luca described how their coming out was, quote, "often used as an invitation. Since we're talking about how you have sex, let's talk about how you have sex," unquote. This perceived invitation manifested in different ways. For some participants, like Luca, coming out was seen by colleagues as the opportunity to ask sexualized questions or make sexualized comments. For others, an LGBTQ identity was perceived as an invitation to sexualize or fetishize participants, as queerness was perceived as inherently sexual. And most serious, some participants experienced threats of sexual violence that would seemingly fix their gender or sexuality. Concerningly, 75% of participants did not report their most impactful experience of workplace sexual harassment. While this proportion does not largely differ from broad population studies, the reasons LGBTQ young people chose not to report were frequently linked to their gender or sexuality. Luca told us, quote, "saying it out loud over the phone, I would have to come out again and be like, here's what happened. It happened because I'm queer, and I would have to explain it," unquote. Workplace sexual harassment had many impacts, both general and on participants' LGBTQ identity. 57% had indicated that their outness at work had been impacted, and 42% indicated experiencing negative feelings regarding their LGBTQ identity. Luca noted that, quote, "there's an added aspect of gender dysphoria to the harassment that I received. That is, because I am perceived as a woman, I get all in my head about the gender, unquote. Surrounding these incidents of workplace sexual harassment, there were contextual factors that made LGBTQ young people more vulnerable to workplace sexual harassment. Age was one factor, as described by Luca, who said of their perpetrators, quote, "These were my managers, I was a minor, and it was a power imbalance." Broader workplace context influenced whether workplaces were a safe place, including attitudes of ignorance and hostility from colleagues, and workplace policies, processes, and infrastructures. For example, uniforms could be positive or negative, depending on how they aligned with participants' identity or if they erased the visibility of their queer pride. The last chapter of the report lists recommendations for policymakers and workplaces. We need systemic change backed by concrete actions, asking hard questions and being prepared for these difficult answers. This report, and all of us here today, is an important step toward understanding LGBTQ experiences of workplace sexual harassment and toward creating safe and inclusive workplaces. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kerry, to Erika and to Emma for giving us an incredibly thorough, if brief, run through of the report. And really to all of you for the work that's gone into the production of the report, the engagement with really important communities in the centering of the evidence base and in the work ahead, including the discussion that we're about to have. I'm going to introduce now the panel, and we're really just so thrilled to be joined by a panel that includes the report authors, LGBTQ youth advocates, and people, no one better really positioned this panel to unpack the report's findings on the unique experiences of LGBTQ young people in terms of sexual harassment in the workplace and in workplace training. Our panel facilitator is Dr. Cristyn Davies. Cristyn is a Senior Research Fellow in the Specialty of Child and Adolescent Health at the Faculty of Medicine and Health at the University of Sydney, and also an adjunct in the School of Social Sciences here with expertise in gender and sexuality diversity, sexual and reproductive health, vaccination for young people, and knowledge translation and implementation science, and is someone that I've been really privileged to learn from going back, in fact, many decades now, particularly in terms of steering my own understanding about this work. So I'm just so thrilled to introduce you, Cristyn, to then facilitate the panel. And I will just introduce properly the panel who'll be joining us back here, including again, Distinguished Professor Kerry Robinson, who we have introduced. But Kerry, I did want to really do justice to your role. I know we were in a hurry to kind of move through to the panel, but to recognise your role here at the School of Social Sciences at Western Sydney University and your reputation as a leading scholar in childhood and young people, gender and sexuality diversity, LGBTQ+ health and wellbeing, sexual harassment, gender and sexuality-based anti-violence and social justice. Joining Kerry and Cristyn in the panel, we have Kimberley, a young queer mixed race researcher living and working on Darug land, Dr. Kimberley Allison, and their research foci span young and LGBTQ people's health, online communities and antisocial behaviour. So the studies right at the intersection of their interests. As a Senior Research Officer on the Speaking Out at Work project, Kimberley was responsible for the survey and interview design, data collection, analysis and write-up of this work. Excuse me. We have panellist Jay Charlton. Jay is a disability, youth and queer advocate who has been working in the sector for almost 20 years. At a young age, Jay knew that systems weren't looking after their needs and that the required change would be a process of accountability, awareness and education. Jay has worked across multiple levels of advocacy and governmental agencies, where she now spends most of her time as a member of the Impact Board at the Accountability Futures Collective, aiming to hold systems accountable so that they can stop hurting generations of young people. Jay's also an elite para-athlete in seated throwing and has represented Australia at the Commonwealth Games. And lastly, Catherine Pudner is a designer and anthropologist originally from Auckland, New Zealand, a mixed race, bisexual cis woman and a member of the stakeholder advisory group on this study. Catherine has been involved with LGBTQ communities and gendered violence related organisations in both New Zealand and Australia for several years. She takes a special interest in intersectional feminism and issues related to human diversity, identity and social activism. Catherine is a creative at heart and currently works as a UX/UI designer in Sydney.
Thanks so much, Tessa. I've known Tessa for many years, so it's a thrill and a delight to have her in such a fantastic position because she's incredible CEO. So thank you for such a lovely introduction. I'd also like to acknowledge the Barramadigal people of the Darug Nation and pay my respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people both in the room and online today. And I'd also like to acknowledge that it's International Day of People with Disability. So thank you for being here. Kerry, I've got the first question for you, and that's, what do you think some LGBTQ young people, why do they question whether the sexual harassment they experience is actually sexual harassment?
I think that Tessa alluded to this earlier, and that is that when we actually have a look at, you know, many decades really of sexual harassment, certainly through the media, through advertising and all those sorts of various contexts, public contexts, the image that we get is very much that it is all framed in a heterosexual framework. And so when we talk about sexual harassment, we tend to get very much strong stereotypes about the boss and the secretary, you know, the slap on the backside, that sort of process. And what we do see is that reiterated, certainly in popular media, like, you know, if we can go back to 9 to 5, you know, which I think was in the 70s, late 70s, right 80s. Oh, I'm sure it goes back earlier than that too. And yeah. Yeah, so it goes back as far as that and right down to, you know, she said in recent times. So the images that we get are very much reinforcing that particular stereotype. Now, that's not to say that that doesn't happen. That does happen, but there is much more to understanding sexual harassment and who experiences and how they experience that behaviour. And until we actually get a sense of that definition, you know, going beyond that stereotype, we're still going to continue to have that perspective dominating, but we need to intervene in that and intervene in it, you know, pretty strongly.
Would any of the other panellists like to make comment on that question? I've got another question for Kerry coming up, but I'm just wondering whether or not you wanted to make comment on that. No, okay. The report discusses the need to address intersectionality when understanding workplace sexual harassment. Kerry, what is intersectionality and how is it relevant to workplace sexual harassment?
Okay, well, intersectionality is one of those things that I'm sure everyone's heard of, probably haven't, you know, sort of, placed it within the context of the word itself, but it's understanding that particular aspects of who we are actually have already influenced by other aspects of our life. So what I mean by that is that gender, for example, is always shaped by other components of who we are, whether that's our sexuality, whether that's you know, age, whether that is whether, you know, our ability or disability, our ethnicity, our race. They all actually work together, and they can't be separated out. So the increased social inequalities that are associated with those particular aspects or categories increase one's vulnerability or powerlessness in certain circumstances that increases their likelihood of being sexually harassed by someone. So, for example, age was a really big factor. And as we know, you know, Tessa alluded to that as well, that quite often young people are in low-paid, insecure jobs and casual jobs, and quite often don't have the workplace experience as well or knowledge about their rights, so therefore are vulnerable. Now, if you place that within the context of being LGBTQ, then that increases their vulnerability because of the additional experiences that they have or powerless that they have associated with that gender or sexuality diversity. Then, if you actually then someone who is a young person who has an LGBTQ identity and has a disability, that places them at even more risk or likelihood of experiencing these behaviours because of powerlessness. And that's in those specific instances. That's not to say that a disability in some other instances can be a really powerful thing for people, and same as LGBT identities and being young. So it's within those circumstances that actually exists.
Thanks very much, Kerry. I think both Tessa and perhaps Emma as well mentioned that some young people in the study reported experiencing workplace sexual harassment that was explicitly targeting their LGBTQ identity. And some reported experiencing comments and threats of sexual violence to, in inverted commas, correct or fix their gender identity and sexuality diversity. Kimberley and Jay, would you like to comment on that finding?
Yeah, of course. So as Emma highlighted it in their presentation, these were some of the most common sexual harassment behaviours reported by the LGBTQ young people in our study. And they're also not always picked up as workplace sexual harassment because of how it differs from the sorts of definitions we see in training, in media, in society. And so it's really important for this report to highlight those, to draw attention to them so we can improve the recognition there. As you say, Cristyn, these threats and comments about correcting someone's queer identity are some of the most shocking, particularly as they were often accompanied by other sexual harassment behaviours, cornering, stalking, physical assault in some cases. But there are also behaviours that target people's queer identities that deviate more from traditional workplace sexual harassment and that are less recognised as unacceptable. And these include things like comments and jokes aiming to invalidate someone's identity, dead naming, misgendering, questioning whether your identity is real, either generally or for you specifically. As Emma highlighted, a lot of intrusive questioning about people's sex lives reported by 57%, I think, and about their anatomy reported by 30-something%. And these are invasive, they're explicit, and they're repeated. And our participants told us that these are questions that would be really obviously inappropriate to ask a cisgender or heterosexual person. You know, you'd never walk up to someone and ask them what's in their pants. Well, you shouldn't. It's more recognized to be inappropriate otherwise. There was a sense of real objectification of queer young people in this context. They're treated as freaks, they're treated as curiosities, or having some purpose to educate other people and to take on that labor. Their rights to privacy, a lot of details that are obviously inappropriate to ask, they just weren't seen to have that right to keep that to themselves and were expected to answer that. There was also a lot of fetishization of people's gender and sexual identities associated with this idea from before about queer identities being inherently sexual. And a particularly troubling one was incidents where LGBTQ young people were portrayed as predators themselves. You've seen all the bathroom, the change room discourse, this idea that we are not actually the vulnerable ones, we are the threats. And that was used to justify a lot of reverse sexual harassment and aggression in that case. And those are also, I think, really important to highlight. This kind of harassment targeting queer identities is not just hurtful from a regular sexual harassment perspective, but it's also really hurtful to have something that's inherently part of you targeted. It messes with how you think about yourself, how you think about your identity, and it's hard to not internalize that, no matter how comfortable and confident you are in your identity.
Yeah, when young people enter the workplace, it's scary enough to go in there and try and be as vulnerable as possible, try and get the work done. But when you've got intersecting identities and on top of that, it is incredibly frustrating, terrifying, and just ultimately it stops you from being able to do the work that you want to do. And as the research so beautifully displays, there are so many ways that sexual harassment and other harassment types show up for LGBT people. A lot of the young people that we speak to at the Accountable Futures Collective face so many very different ways that, you know, you wouldn't expect harassment to be, like dead naming. Dead naming is one of the biggest things that our young people come up and say, hey, we really want workplaces to stop doing this because it harms who we are. It harms who we are as a person, who we are as a part of our identity, but ultimately who we want to be on this planet. we don't want to have to conform to what other people think we are. We want to be who we are. And it is it's one of the biggest things that come to us. And also having people ask what's in your pants is another massive one. And that, especially within the trans community, has been really harmful, especially with the rhetoric coming out of the US right now. It's spreading to Australia, and it's making it even harder for young people, part of the trans community, to go to work safely, to be asked what's in your pants and then try and go about your day at work. That doesn't work. And so, yeah, it is really, really harmful to our young people.
Thank you so much, Kimberley and Jay, for such comprehensive responses. Young LGBTQ people with disability, as we've heard this morning, were a large cohort of the study, 53% of the 1,000 plus participants in the research, with a significant percentage, 83%, experiencing workplace sexual harassment. Jay, what are the challenges for someone who is LGBTQ and has a disability to report their experience of sexual harassment in the workplace?
So because of the two intersecting identities, there are, as we've just heard, there are those barriers of being queer. So you're being asked all these invasive questions. You're being asked, why are you living this way when you could be living the way that I want you to live? And then you're also being asked about accommodations that, are they really necessary for you to go to work? Are they really necessary for you to have a ramp or a key card to the bathroom or be allowed in the building on your free will? It's all builds up on top of the person over and over and over again, and it really pushes them down. But to also be able to report it is triply difficult because HR departments are not held accountable to the standards that us as LGBT people really want to be able to have systems be held to. There is no understanding of accountability in the LGBT space because policies are created for the heteronormative population. Add disability to that, and people are never going to understand because people don't understand what it's like to live with a disability. And so when someone goes to go report a harassment claim, you have to go talk to a manager. What happens if you have difficulties communicating? What happens if you can't even comprehend in your own brain how to verbalize that? What happens if you can't even get to the office because it's not accessible to you because you're in a wheelchair or have other mobility issues? Then you have to go through the whole process of reliving that trauma over and over and over again and try and actually verbalize that before your point is even put across to it being resolved, maybe resolved. That is a lot for someone to handle, and having that with a disability and being queer, it's almost impossible. And so, yeah, those are just some of the barriers that we face as queer disabled people.
Thank you so much for that, Jay. And I'll just sort of reiterate that I think some of the findings too in the report reflect that young people who identified themselves as neurodiverse expressed finding it challenging to identify whether or not they'd actually experienced sexual harassment, or they were actually questioning their capacity to read the environment and what was going on. So there are certainly lots of challenges that young people highlighted in the research. Catherine, 75% of LGBTQ young people in our study did not report sexual harassment they experienced at work. Why don't you think they report this behaviour?
Yeah, it's a great question. And there are many, many reasons why people, especially young LGBTQ people, don't report. Obviously, there's always a big fear of what would happen if I reported. What would the outcome be? Would I be taken seriously? Would other people find out? Would there be some kind of retaliation? Would I be seen differently? I think a common reason I hear amongst my friends and colleagues is that there's also a lack of faith that anything would happen if they did report, speaking to these accountability structures. I also think that ties into a lot of the experiences of young LGBTQ people, which is that often when they bring up a report or an instance of sexual harassment with a manager or someone more senior on their team, it's very common for these people to dismiss it or brush it under the rug. They might say something like, oh, so-and-so didn't mean that, they were just joking. So-and-so is from an older generation, they're traditional, you know, they can't change. And I think that kind of constant invalidation or dismissal really really tarnish or really compromises your confidence that something would happen if you spoke up. Of course, going back to the fear of retaliation, just want to mention, like, these are not just feelings of paranoia. They're actually very real. I've seen in my friends and my colleagues where their job or how they, you know, the behaviors of other people in their team change, and eventually they would have to leave that workplace entirely, or people actually lost job opportunities because of their queerness and because of speaking up about the harassment that they felt. These are just some of the reasons, but there are so many, so many.
Thanks so much for that, both of you, for those comprehensive responses. Kerry, I'll open it up to you too. What are your thoughts about why some young people don't report sexual harassment?
Thank you. I think that Jay and Catherine have made some really important points there. But what I would reiterate is the fact that in many workplaces, those processes are unsafe, they are not confidential, and quite often that reporting is going to someone who could be the harasser. So when you have internalized processes like that, that don't actually provide an alternative pathway, if the harasser is someone who is in that process, then there's nowhere for these young people to go or anyone to go to at this point. So for a lot of young people, who experience this behaviour feel like it's too risky for them to actually go through this process. And, you know, as it was pointed out, quite often, 75% of them didn't report. Then that, you know, those people who did report, which was a small percentage of 20, it was about 25, 27%, made the point that they were dissatisfied with the whole process. It was not it didn't come out in a way that their voices were heard or their experiences were taken, you know, seriously. So we've got a lot of work to do in terms of best processes in, you know, reporting, and hopefully with the new sexual harassment workplace regulations, then we might start to see some of that change, hopefully.
Thank you so much, Kerry. Kimberley, how does workplace culture influence workplace sexual harassment of LGBTQ young people?
Yeah, so many ways, both in terms of the cultures around LGBTQ safety and inclusion and the cultures that exist around workplace sexual harassment more broadly. So looking at cultures in workplaces that are hostile or that make queerness invisible, this gives rise both directly and indirectly to targeted incidents of workplace sexual harassment. It really legitimizes negative commentary on expressions of queerness. So if you're in a place that is like either explicitly or implicitly discouraging any expressions of individuality, of being out at work, anything that you do is like, well, now you're asking for it, you know, because you came out, you dressed like that. A lot of blaming around that. It legitimizes invalidating commentary, and that's really common in some workplaces. And that stuff all discourages how able you are in a workplace to speak out about your experiences, to report, to have any belief that you're going to get support or be taken seriously for that. There are also some really interesting cultures in workplaces that people perceived to want to look inclusive, but weren't doing the work to actually be inclusive. There's a concept of rainbow washing where people will like to put up a flag and be like, we love queer people, come and apply and work for us, giving the impression to LGBTQ young people that it's safe and acceptable to be out in the workplace, but they're not actually doing anything to ensure that safety. And that's really dangerous for us, you know, because you might come into a workplace, be like, great, I can be myself. And then you find that you're actually harassed by that and there's not the support that you think there might be. We saw, for instance, in our interviews, people who talked about retail workplaces that had displays for Pride, for Mardi Gras. And even though that was the company wanting to portray an image of themselves being inclusive and accepting, those displays actually became the prompts for people being harassed for being visibly queer in that workplace. So again, like actively putting people in danger, even though they might have been well-intentioned ostensibly. There's also systems and infrastructures that are cis-heteronormative, and that can give rise to situations where harassment of queer people takes place. Again, the bathrooms, the change rooms, the binary gendered uniforms, forms that out people. These often get overlooked in terms of culture, but they can be really dangerous in terms of outing us and exposing us to workplace sexual harassment. There's also the cultures of harassment themselves. There are workplaces where this is really normalized and kind of seen as just how a workplace is, and it's not taken seriously. This happens in both like a sexist, misogynist way, but also in an industry way. So in terms of dynamics of sexism and misogyny, we'd heard people talk about the boys' clubs, this culture of all these men doing these things and being untouchable. But this also happened in industries like retail and hospitality, two really common workplaces for young people to be in, where it was like, well, it just happens so much. We cannot report everything. We can't take action against a client. We need their money, you know? And so this is just something that you have to endure and we can't do anything to change. And these were reflected in both how people responded to workplace sexual harassment, the sort of training that they did about workplace sexual harassment, and the lack of consequences that were around for people who perpetrated it.
Thank you so much, Kimberley. Catherine, what is the impact of workplace sexual harassment on LGBTQ young people? It's a big question.
A huge question. And again, many different kinds of impacts, massive impacts. I often, in my own experiences and those of my friends and colleagues, I see a few really common themes. So obviously there's massive impacts to your health and well-being. There's also impacts to your sense of self and your identity. And then there's also impacts to your work, your career, showing up in the workplace and that kind of thing. Just speaking to those last couple of themes, and then maybe we can circle back to the first one. I feel like the impact on your sense of self as a young LGBTQ person is massive, because if you're constantly experiencing sexual harassment, you might start to question your identity. You might start to feel different about your identity, but also how you show up as your full self. You might start thinking things like, why is this happening to me? Is it my fault? You know, do I continue showing up as my true self, or should I not do that again? Was it my fault for coming out in the first place? And that's really hard. It's really hard. And I think, yeah, if people are constantly invalidating your identity, then you might start to question it as well. You might start to even resent it a little bit. Everything's happening to me because I'm queer. And that's really hard too. I think it also affects how you show up in the workplace. So obviously experiencing sexual harassment changes how you show up day to day. You might start to isolate yourself a bit more. You might start to mistrust those in your team, especially those who may have observed that harassment and didn't support you or didn't speak up. I feel like that you often might consider that you need to leave the workplace, you need to quit and get a new job, but that's not actually an option that's available to most people. And so what I find is that a lot of young queer people will start to weigh up their safety with their income. And I think that's a really hard and pervasive impact, because young queer people then start to compromise on what's tolerable sexual harassment, which is awful, and it just exposes them to more. So massive impacts. And then of course that has an impact on your mental health and well-being, but I might pass on to Jay for that.
Yeah, Jay, if you could follow up with what you think the health impacts of workplace sexual harassment are for LGBTQ people, that would be wonderful. And thank you, Catherine, for your response.
Yeah, so the workplace impact for queer people with disabilities specifically is massive, because it's been explained wonderfully that it's affecting mental health, it affects physical health, and it affects your sense of identity. If all of those things are happening, then that exacerbates your disability, and then you're unable to go to work. And that actually puts you at more risk, because if you're not turning up to work after something has happened, they'll either automatically think, oh, you're just ditching because we've called you out for something, or you don't want to face us. And so that puts you at more danger, because of your queerness, but it also puts you in more danger because of your physical health or your mental health. And you either end up in hospital or worse. And we certainly don't want that. And I have seen throughout my career a lot of people who have turned up to work, tried their absolute hardest to do the job at hand, and the workplace are just like, oh, you're just a bit too disabled for us, so we're going to let you go. And that's not on. And that was after trying to be who they are, trying to be as present as possible at work. And it was not accepted by the workplace itself and the culture that it had created. And then also, if you have a disability and then you're sick and then you can't turn up to work, the system itself of the hospital system can't look after you either. And so then it is just a repeating cycle of a lack of accountability across multiple systems who aren't going to be there on the lookout for you. And so it's trying to make sure that the queer person with a disability can maintain their physical health, maintain their mental health, while still being able to turn up to work, but also be safely turning up to work. It's multiple impacts across the whole thing, and it can end up with someone being dead, honestly. It is a major, major impact.
Thank you so much for that, Jay. This is a question for all panellists. What recommendations would you give employers to try and curb workplace sexual harassment of LGBTQ young people?
My recommendation is that we need more accountability measures in our policies. The policies we currently have in the workplace are not fit for purpose, and they're not fit to actually hold the systems accountable to the people that they're actually serving. And that's across all systems. But specifically in the workplace, to look after LGBTQ young people, we need policies that are fit and purposely built by young people who are queer, so that they protect young people who are queer. It can't be and I'm sorry for any old white guys in the room, but it can't be old white guys creating policies for people who aren't them. It doesn't work that way. And so we need those systems to be held accountable by creating policies made for young people by young people. And that's what I would like to see.
Thanks, Jay. That resonates with me a lot as well. I think one of the things that I would recommend is that if you're wanting to have a safe workplace and inclusive culture at work, then you really need to commit to it. And I think that's about not approaching safeness or inclusivity as like a tick box thing. It's not something that we look at once and then it's done. We've met the standard. It's actually an ongoing process. It requires that you're constantly being reflexive. You're constantly reflecting on, are we meeting the needs? Is this safe? It's about constantly gathering feedback and iterating, improving, and being open to feedback that you might not want to hear. You know, knowing that you're not going to get it right, but how you respond to that is really important. Because that's how you get to a safe place and support the people, young LGBTQ people, to feel safe at work.
I feel like you've covered all things so eloquently. Yeah, I want to reiterate, hanging up a pride flag on the wall is easy. Doing the work to change the culture is really hard, and it involves facing consequences and making tough decisions that people have often been reluctant to make. You know, sometimes the people who are harassing your employees are influential, or they're skilled, or they're talented, and enforcing consequences, you know, it might be in some ways seen as a loss to the organization. But how much are we expected to endure in order to keep those people around? And what are we losing when we do so? So being prepared to make those tough choices to actually do the work and not just look like you're doing the work.
Well, yeah, that's I think you've definitely hit each one on the nail very, very well. I think that workplaces need to be positively and proactively dealing with these issues that are part of the workplace culture that exists. It needs to, as I think Catherine said, it can't be, the training can't be a ticker box process. And that's what seems to me, based on the young people who participated in this research, indicated that's what was going on in their workplaces. They did a ticker box process and that was it. There was no learning in there. There was no understanding of how sexual harassment intersects with homophobia and transphobia, or any other issues of racism that are part of that process as well, or the issues facing people with disability. So there is a really important need to look at the way that those policies that are related to workplace sexual harassment actually incorporate those particular issues around intersectionality and how it works and how it impacts on the types of behaviours and what is going on for young people and the impact of that. So it's got to go beyond that process to something that is far more about, well, what does an inclusive workplace look like? And, you know, those inclusive workplaces and dealing with these issues won't be just positive things for LGBTQ plus young people. It'll be positive for all workers.
Thanks so much, Kerry. And the last question before we open it up to the audience is for you, Kerry. Employers are legally required to include prevention training on workplace sexual harassment. What did the research show about the training that participants received? I know you just touched on that slightly in your previous research.
Yeah, I think that that's what it was. It was a ticker box process, and I think Kimberley made a point there too that, or I think that most of that training did not have, or it might have been Emma, I think, in the presentation, made the point that that training, I think it was about 8% of it, actually included some relevance to the lives of LGBTQ people. Going back to the point right from the very beginning is that this behaviour or understandings of the behaviour are heteronormalised, placed within a heterosexual context. So that just keeps reinforcing that point. So we need to have a look at that. And the new regulations are about doing positive and proactive interventions here and showing what they're doing to actually deal with these sorts of behaviours. So workplaces must be doing that now. And the other thing is that young people said that positive training looks like a combination of online relevant training, but in-person discussions, because what online training doesn't do is deal with the nuances, the greyness of a lot of this behaviour. And so the best way that we need to do that training, if we're really going to make a difference, is to work out a way that there is a combination of those two things, online and face-to-face training. Now that might mean employers saying, well, this is going to cost us a fortune to do this, but sexual harassment costs a workplace in our country a lot of money, and the impact that it has on people is unfathomable.
Thanks very much, Kerry. Thank you so much to all the panellists for responding to all of these questions. We're now going to open up for questions, and we've got questions online and we've got questions in the room. I might start with one in the room, and I'd actually like to start or invite a young person. You can self-identify as a young person. Whether or not you'd like to ask any questions first, because I know it can be tough to ask a question. So I'm just going to throw it out there to, I don't know whether to make eye contact with anyone, or that's not very fair, is it? We'll give you time. We'll give you time to think about it. I'll now open it up to people that are also not young people, and you can self-identify as well. And if there are any questions, I'll run over with the microphone. Okay. Great, thank you.
In addition to building, like, co-designing policy and ensuring that the voices of the affected are in the room, The research also seemed to suggest that there is an issue in identifying what is happening is sexual harassment. And so I'd love to hear about what we can do about that as well, for young people to be able to recognise, and so to not necessarily centre the discomfort, but to centre that something wrong has happened to them by another person and to seek redress.
I'll start and say that, I think that also goes back to training, and it goes back to the policies and what the policies are saying. And I think that if we're actually doing that co-designing and co-development of those policies, then that is integral to that understanding. But I think that, once again, the training has to highlight the intersections of these behaviours. And it's not just for LGBTQ young people knowing it. It is about all workers knowing it. If LGBT people don't feel like they know it, then, it goes beyond that. So there's a lot of work to be done there.
Thanks, Kerry. I think it's a really great point. I just wanted to add that I think it's really important when it comes to training that it's done by other people who are part of the communities that we're trying to support, right? So when it comes to training around LGBTQ young people experiences, or just queer experiences as general, I think it goes a long way to hear from older queer people about, and kind of, that this was sexual harassment, that really adds to the confidence of speaking up, but also knowing where those boundaries are. Because if you're not sure and you don't have a role model or someone to speak to within your workplace, having someone in training or even just in your community goes a long way, I think.
It also needs to be accessible. So there needs to be easy read versions. There needs to be disability specific training models within that, so that everybody can actually have an equal understanding of what is sexual harassment. Because as we said, neurodiverse people are often going to sit there and be like, oh, what the heck have I just experienced? Was that harassment or was it not? So yeah, it needs to be accessible in all different ways.
Thank you so much, everyone. We've got a question online. Could you speak more about the experiences of culturally diverse young people, thinking particularly about migrant young people that may have less knowledge about avenues for support or less access to social support?
Yeah, great question. And I love to talk about it a lot. I think going back to what Kerry said about intersectionality before, people with intersecting identities, intersecting marginalized identities, and particularly around cultural and ethnic and diversity and migration history, they don't just experience an increased risk of workplace sexual harassment, but the harassment that they experience is really colored by racism and anti-immigrant attitudes as well. And it affects how it shows up. There's a lot of sexual stereotypes in media and society, and that identities are seen as inherently sexual and therefore sexualized. There's an entitlement to details of the identity in a way that's similar to what queer young people experience as well. I lost the second half of the question.
The second half of the question is thinking particularly about migrant young people that may have less knowledge about avenues for support or less access to social support.
Yeah, it's true. And it's really hard, particularly if you're not familiar with the workplace culture in Australia, to kind of work out what is acceptable and to know who to go to for support, to know the organisations who are out there.
Thank you so much. I've got lots of questions online, but I just wanted to open it up to questions in the room again.
Thank you, and thank you for all the panels there. It's really nice report and very inspiring. I'm Adrian. Actually, the previous question already asked my question, but I have something a little bit additional to ask regarding Aboriginal people in this community, young people, especially like living with disability, their situation, their context of suffering from sexual harassment in this space. Do you have any fundings or any ideas on this, and how we can support and help them, no matter in education perspective or from the perspective of policy? Thank you.
I can speak a bit to the experiences reported by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in our study. It was interesting that it showed up in a slightly different way to culturally and linguistically diverse people from other backgrounds, in that in this particular study, there wasn't as much of that fetishization, and instead what was reported was something closer to sexual racism. So people making comments of, I hate repeating it, but like, you're hot for a slur. I've never had a sexual interaction with a person of this background before. It was really coloured by a lot of anti-Indigenous attitudes that you see in society. And it was also, like the queer targeted forms of harassment that we saw, not the kind of thing that was covered in training. I see people like online, you'll see that some of that is actually not seen as a bad thing at all. It's kind of portrayed as a veiled compliment, even when it's not, and it's very hurtful.
Yeah. That was a really important point about that distinction that actually occurred. I think that in terms of policy and training, once again, policies and training, policies are part of educating people as well. And they have to be framed in a way that actually highlights the various ways that these behaviours are experienced across different groups, for a start. And the training is crucial in terms of actually bringing out those experiences, so that we have workers that are aware of their everyday interactions with people can actually be sexual harassment, and that it isn't acceptable in the workplace. So I think right across the board, in terms of diversity, we need to look at the way that policies and training address those in the most appropriate ways.
Thanks very much, Kerry. I'll go to a question online and then we can come back to the room. Do you have any thoughts on the importance of data collection in organisational systems to understand the issue of sexual harassment for different cohorts, including LGBT, young people, and people with disabilities and other intersections?
Before I hand it over, I think that there is something there that if you can, you've got to collect data, and people have got to be trusting to give it. And if the processes aren't there for people to, I guess, report those behaviours in safe and confidential ways, we won't get the proper data.
Without data, we don't have knowledge. Without knowledge, we don't get awareness. Without awareness, we don't get funding. Without funding, we don't get change. It is vitally important that we collect data about intersecting identities across this topic, because otherwise nothing is going to change. There is no way that we are going to be able to know the experiences, the lived experiences of folks experiencing this kind of harassment, and there won't be further research. And I was saying to Dr. Cristyn and to Kerry that I was so over the moon to see this report come out, because in my lifetime, I've very rarely seen a report that is so comprehensive on both LGBT, but also had a massive sect of disability in there. And I have worked with the Bureau of Statistics before, and we've said time and time again, we need more data to get more funding, to get more change. And that's why we keep fighting to be in the census at bare minimum. And so, yeah, it is vitally important to collect data in a safe, sane and consensual way, but also to have it to make change.
Thank you so much. And I know there was another question in the room. Someone had their hand up.
Hi everyone, I'm Xavier. I use they them pronouns as well. I might get the wording of this completely botched, but I'm really curious. I'm hearing a lot around what workplaces can do, and I'm just wondering, what is the role of community within all of these spaces? And one thing I've struggled is finding my power and community to help me through this process. I'm just wondering, any tips or thoughts on that type of topic would be really appreciated.
The power of community is so important. When it comes to trying to change systems, you need people to back you. Otherwise, it's one against a monster, honestly. And so there are a lot of organizations out there that are community-based. So like Accountable Futures Collective, like Youth Action, like People with Disabilities Australia. There's a lot of different groups out there that fight from a community basis, but it doesn't have to be an organization. It can be your local trans get-together groups. It can be a LGBT D&D club. It can be whatever you want it to be. But as long as you come together and share your experiences with each other and make a plan for yourselves to stay safe, but also be able to work together to be like, okay, what's one thing that I can do to hold my workplace accountable tomorrow? And that could be talking to my co-workers about my lived experience as a non-binary disabled person and be like, hey, I'm really struggling with people not using my preferred pronouns, or I'm really struggling with people using my dead name. It's just that slow process of how can I make change slowly? And you'll find your people. They're out there, and I can absolutely guarantee that. It is just finding it in the places that are most comfortable for you.
I'd add to that, and that is that we had a lot of advisory group members from different communities that have been very positive about what they might be able to do to help, get this information out there. And I think they're out there, as Jay said, and I think that we've all got some work to do in terms of actually getting this information out to the community as well. And I think that's certainly on our agenda to do that. And I think that our community partners like LGBTQ Health Australia, for example, 2010, are all very, very keen to work out how we work together collectively to make a difference on this issue in the workplace. So we're there.
Thanks very much. I just wanted to mention too, there's a link for those of you online through the YouTube description to send us any questions. How much of the sexual harassment took place on digital channels, and what form did it take?
Wow, I shouldn't have put technology in my research bio. Yeah, so quite a proportion of the people that we spoke to did have technology facilitated harassment as part of their experience. Emma will know the exact stat, I don't. But it was often in combination with in-person face-to-face harassment, and things also switched between platforms quite regularly. There were cases, for example, of people being tracked down online and having private details exposed, being outed by their online presence, all the things that you would imagine any kind of tech medium can be used to harass someone. So whether that be blackmailing someone about their identity, spreading photos, anything like that. It's a really pervasive problem, and it's one that I don't think workplaces are keeping up with in terms of how they make policy and how they make decisions about that. It actually has a flip side, though, in the fact that sometimes there was more record, more paper trail if things happen online. But broadly, we're not, as industry, as academics, across that manifestation enough. And there's a lot of places that we can learn, I think, from people who are investigating specifically tech-facilitated harassment about that and the intersections with queerness there.
One of the things that I would point out was that in person, in the workplace, face-to-face sexual harassment was the most common experience for people. So, the online stuff was important, but overwhelmingly it's the face-to-face stuff that was an issue.
Are there any questions in the room? Rachel?
Yeah, I'm Rachel Skinner, she, her, from Sydney Children's Hospitals Network and Sydney University. So thinking about, say, improving safety and inclusion for LGBTQ young people and staff, so you've talked about a few things. So education, training, really important. So I'm wondering if there are really good initiatives that we can tap into that do the sort of work that we need to do, that you've articulated, that we need to understand about how to make our institutions safe and inclusive, and also address sexual harassment in the workplace, and also look at policies across the institution and how they, discriminate or whatever, inadvertently perhaps. So do we have anything that we can go to that is able to actually, and is effective in promoting inclusive and safe environments for people to work in, all people?
Look, I think that there's a dearth of resources specifically for LGBTQ people around this issue, largely because it hasn't been a focus of what has happened in terms of addressing this problem. ANROS, for example, have got a major lot of resources on your website. The Australian Human Rights Council has got Human Rights Council has got that. Sorry, and certainly the sex discrimination, I'm sure that you've probably got things on your website as well to address this, but we need to have more specific resources co-designed with young people to address the problem.
Is there any opportunity to work with NGOs to provide training for workplaces and for an accreditation system to ensure transparency to the commitment level of workplaces? I mean, my answer is yes, but
Absolutely. I think that we need to be working with, part of the co-design process needs to be needs to be working with organisations as well, to community organisations as well, to actually do this work. It's a collective process, and we need to come at it at all different levels to make that, to make it work in a most effective way. So yes, we should be working with non-government organisations and community organisations and with government organisations to do this work.
I have to say that, having run an NGO and running another one, I think that NGOs do some of the most innovative work in this space, but that's my view. I've got a question from a young person online. How much of an effect do you think the mindset of educating our colleagues has had on our tolerance for questions and comments about our LGBTQ identity and our inability to identify sexual harassment?
I think it certainly blurs the boundaries, particularly for people who are taking on an explicit education role. So for example, we had teachers who are leading their Gay Straight Alliance, their people running queer initiatives within their workplace. I think having yourself set up as being the person who is the go-to for LGBTQ issues and who is fielding those questions can make it really easy for that to cross a line into ones that are more intrusive, more invasive, ones that either unintentionally or maliciously are undermining the sense of identity itself. And that's work that is quite often not compensated and not recognized by the workplaces. Obviously it varies, but for a lot of people, that's a lot of emotional labor to be doing, often on top of an actual job they get paid for.
Yes, absolutely. It is very taxing sometimes to be always the one to teach people about our lived experiences and what they need to do to learn more about our community, when the responsibility should lie on the person without education to educate themselves. Yes, the queer people are out there to provide advice and are willing to hand over said advice. But if it does breach into, oh, you've given advice before, I can ask you about your weird experiences and your private information, then that's not on. That's where we need to be able to support our educators to keep themselves safe and also teach the wider public that there are so many resources out there to educate themselves, and that the oversaturation of lived experience without compensation, without support, and without proper wellbeing care is not on. And so, yeah, we need to make sure that there is a healthy balance between education and self-education.
I would finish with another point on that, and that is that the report actually finishes with a young person saying that they had to think about these sorts of behaviours because they are so common in their life that, you know, they had to think about it, and their comment was, is this just like everyday garden variety homophobia and transphobia that I get, or is this sexual harassment? And I think that there's something in that.
And just another question from a young person, which will be our final question, although I've got a question that I'm going to actually throw open to Tessa and Anna in particular. I hope that's okay. Circling back to trying to recognise whether or not behaviours are harassment, do you have any advice for those who already question their reality on a daily basis, even before the impacts on their sense of self invalidate their identities? So it's really a young person trying to understand the difference between sexual harassment and the impact that's having.
Absolutely. It is really difficult. It is genuinely difficult to question oneself and one's experiences in life. If you have a safe person in your workplace and to be able to confide in them is really important, please do not bottle it up. It is not healthy. It's not safe for you. If you don't have a safe person, I would highly recommend trying to find resources online to self-regulate and talk yourself through what is reality and what is not. It's a DBT process of sort of compartmentalizing all of the thoughts that you're having to see what is real and what is not. Are the experiences that I am having genuine? And if the facts equal the facts, then that is your actual trauma that you've experienced. And I know it's hard to do it by yourself if you do not have that safe person, but it is one of the best ways that I've found that I've had to go through when I didn't have a safe person, when I was facing things at my workplace. And yeah, it's very difficult, but please look after yourself as much as you possibly can, and make sure that if you can find that safe person or that safe somebodies, then do so.
Any other comments?
I'll echo that there's a real value in hearing an external perspective on that. And we found it was really common for young people to be like, I had an experience, I was uncomfortable, and it wasn't until I talked to my friend and they were like, that's sexual harassment, or that's homophobia, that's transphobia. Even sometimes the process of saying it out loud, articulating your experience, thinking about if that was your friends, what would you be saying to them? Sometimes things that were like, I can tolerate that for myself, or I will tolerate that for myself. You see it's happening to someone who you love, who you care about, and you're like, that's unacceptable. So why are we not applying that to ourselves? I personally think that some of us get hung up on the label sexual harassment as being a big, serious thing that we don't want to apply to our own experiences. It's uncomfy, it's scary. I think if you are already feeling uncomfortable by that interaction that you're having, that already says to me that something is wrong with your workplace and something needs to change. Regardless if it meets whoever's criteria, it's something that should be taken seriously if it's making you feel in danger or unsafe.
Thank you so much, Kimberley. Before I invite everyone to thank our panellists today, just a sort of an open question that perhaps could be addressed for the rest of the afternoon is there any work being undertaken with regulatory bodies such as Fair Work, etc.? So I think that's a question for our other experts in the room. But if everyone could please join me in thanking a fantastic discussion, our panellists.
Please, once again, can we thank our incredible panel and facilitator, Jade Charlton, Catherine Pudner, Dr. Kimberley Allison, Professor Kerry Robinson, and Dr. Cristyn Davies for your facilitation. There's so much in this research. It is a big piece of work. It's a really important piece of work, but there's a few things that are just really staying with me from that incredibly important discussion. And I guess the starting point for me is, we did already know that LGBTQ people were disproportionately impacted by domestic, family and sexual violence, but the 77% of respondents in the survey in this research is shockingly high, alongside with the types of behaviours that are being talked about and identified, and particularly that LGBTQ young people are subjected to. And I think it's really incumbent on us. We have to really challenge this assumption that sexual harassment is low level or to be expected. And I think the research really goes a long way to helping us make sense of that. I think the comment on the panel about the connection then for safety at work in the context of sexual harassment and how that crosses over into financial security, again, particularly for young people who we know are so disproportionately affected by income insecurity, particularly. And I guess I was really struck by the panel's comments about the sort of specific targeting of people's identity. And Kimberley, I think you used the language of blaming people's identity. And so that targeting of identity is itself discriminatory and it becomes, again, part of a pattern of behaviour that lots of other people at work never expect to experience, and this kind of codifying of harassment in a way that is so targeted. So I guess what I'm left with from that discussion is really the importance of validating that experience of harassment, the recognition that these are behaviours that are not acceptable. And I think really to your point at the end of the panel, ensuring that even as we are building an evidence base and responsiveness that recognises the intersections in people's lives, that we're also ensuring that we're holding to account the people who are behaving in this way, that we're doing the work to ensure that our policies, our training, our systems and our processes are fit for preventing sexual harassment, responding to that harassment and ensuring that they're fit for everyone's experience, not just for a narrow or traditionally understood experience. So with that, there's no better person to close out our discussion than Anna Cody. Dr. Anna Cody is the Sex Discrimination Commissioner at the Australian Human Rights Commission. Another person I've been really privileged to learn from over many years. And Anna, I really want to thank you for your support for this evidence base that has been built through the Sexual Harassment Research Program, for your real commitment to using evidence to drive change, and particularly for your leadership in highlighting the intersections in people's lives that shape the experiences of domestic, family and sexual violence, including sexual harassment. Thank you, Anna.
Thanks very much, Tessa, and a real pleasure to be here today. And I'd also like to acknowledge the Brahmaputra people of the Darug Nation and pay my respects to elders past and present, and also to any of you who are First Nations people, as well as those who are joining us online. And I really am thrilled to be here to both listen to the panel and to get a glimpse of some of the richness of the report that you've been presenting, led by you, Professor Kerry Robinson, and a range of fantastic advisory people, as well as the panel and the research team. I also really liked the way you started in presenting some of the findings with Luca's story, which you carried throughout. And I think what that shows us is the strength of people's voices and really hearing the stories, the experience and the richness of the depth, the insight, the intelligence behind some of those insights. And it certainly reflects, this piece of research, what we have also been hearing at the Australian Human Rights Commission through a project that we've been running called Speaking from Experience. And we've held 61 in-person and online sessions, specifically wanting to hear the voices of diverse groups and experiences of workplace sexual harassment. We've heard from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander workers, young people, culturally and racially marginalised workers, people with disability, LGBTQI+ workers and other groups that are targeted by harassers. So some of the findings of the research are familiar to me because of the voices that we have been hearing. So I really wanted to focus on some of the key pieces that you've been talking about on the panel. One was the importance of education, and that whole absolutely cannot just be tick a box type of education, but also that it needs to include the experiences of LGBTQI plus people specifically. And I think it's a really deep insight that you have through this research and through what you've been sharing today, is the understanding of sexual harassment. Even though we talk about intersectionality and we think we understand it, we really need to expand our understanding of what is sexual harassment to include the full diversity of our community, the fullness that is our humanity. So that means thinking about racialized sexism, thinking about sexual harassment experienced by LGBTQI plus communities. So knowing that sexual harassment looks for LGBTQI plus people, that invasive nature of questions around sex life, or for trans people around their genitalia or their bodies, and that use of sexualized stereotypes within sexual harassment itself for gay men and for lesbians. So I think while we think we understand intersectionality, I think what this research really reinforces is it actually has to influence law, policy, education in all of the ways in which we actually understand sexual harassment. So I think that question around what are we doing with Fair Work, for example, or any of the other regulators, and I think we have, certainly through the Respect at Work recommendations, there have been a range of ways in which our law has changed, but still there is room to move out from that to really fill out what is sexual harassment, and that border between sex-based harassment and gender and how that impacts particularly for LGBTQI plus people, I think is a really important one that we need to expand out from. The other finding that I just wanted to highlight was that one around casualised work and the impact of temporary work, and that particularly impacts, over 50% of people in this survey, in this research, are on casual contracts, but also for temporary migrants, for people who have been facing both racism in getting a job as well as then keeping that job, and their willingness to then speak out about it. So the intersection between culturally, racially marginalised people and people who are LGBTQI plus. So I welcome this work. I think it's a really important conversation that we're having, an important conversation that we're having in Australia and that we need to continue, and also to really deepen our understanding and how intersectionality impacts on our law, our policy and our education work. So I congratulate all of the researchers for this magnificent piece of work. And I thought I would finish with your words, Jay, which really struck me, which is we want to be who we are, not who you think we are. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Anna. That concludes our formal proceedings today. Many thanks to those who've joined us online for your questions and your engagement in the discussion. To the people who are here with us in person, we invite you to join us for lunch in the foyer. And on behalf of Anna, I want to thank you for joining us in this really important conversation. See you next time.